Welcome. My name is Mary Mitchell. This is my often noisy and wiggly puppy, Abigail. So, welcome to the last of this 5-part series about my great-great-grandparents, Charles and Fanny Ames. They were human rights activists at the end of the 19th century. This video covers the years 1889 to 1931, Fanny's death. While Charles is the minister of a Transcendental Unitarian Church in Boston, his wife Fanny helps to improve child labor laws, women's education, and with the final push to obtain for women the right to vote. In 2019, just a year and a half ago, the Massachusetts State Police Museum honored Fanny and another woman named Mary Ellen Halley as part of the 100-year anniversary of Massachusetts ratifying the 19th Amendment. In this video, I'm going to tell you why. Part 4 ended when Charles's mentor in the Unitarian Church, James Freeman Clark, chose Charles to succeed him as the minister of the Church of Disciples. In Part 2, we explained how James Freeman Clark organized that church in 1841. He chose the name Church of Disciples because he considered every member of a church a disciple of Jesus. In 1848, Clark's congregation built a new edifice on the corner of Warren Avenue and West Brookline Street. That is where Charles Gordon Ames took over the pulpit in 1889. Charles had first joined Clark's church 30 years earlier in 1859. There was a split in the Unitarian Church 11 years earlier when Theodore Parker's Transcendentalists veered away from Dr. Channing's traditional Unitarians. We explained that in the second video. When Parker died in 1860, most of his followers, including Julia Ward Howe and Lucy Stone, moved to James Freeman Clark's church, which is where they were when Charles became the pastor. Julia Ward Howe was 70 and Lucy Stone was 71. Even though Boston will be the Ames's principal residence for the next 23 years, Charles will travel frequently to Philadelphia and continue his work with the Spring Garden Society. Upon their arrival in Massachusetts, 61-year-old Charles and 49-year-old Fanny purchased a home at 12 Chestnut Street on Beacon Hill. 15-year-old Edith Theodora Ames will live with them. Charles's son, with his first wife, Charles Wilberforce Ames, was married and living in St. Paul, Minnesota, with 4 children. Alice Vivian Ames was a student at nearby Wellesley, seeking her master's. Maybe she will live at home and commute. I don't know. I also don't know if Charles was aware of the irony in his choice of residence. The Swan family, who owned the house in which Charles was born in Dorchester in 1828, also owned homes at 13, 15, and 17 Chestnut across the street from number 12. The Swans were related by marriage to Charles's great-aunt, Carolyn Knox, and one of the Swan grandsons, Reverend John Turner Sargent, was also a Unitarian minister in Boston, a good friend of James Freeman Clark, and active in the abolition and suffrage movements. It's funny what genealogical research turns up. But back to our regular scheduled program. Soon after moving to Boston, Charles and Fanny took a commuter train to Wellesley to watch Alice receive her master's degree in classics. This painting of my great-grandmother in her graduation dress hangs on my living room wall. For the next few years, Alice will live at home with her parents and sister Edith while she teaches in the Boston public schools. Charles was an extremely popular minister. Like James Freeman Clark, he liked to write. He contributed articles and poems to Unitarian literature. More than 200 of his sermons were published and widely distributed. His family later donated copies of those sermons to the Massachusetts Historical Society and the Schlesinger Library in Cambridge. Meanwhile, Fanny was busier than ever. Apparently, she planned to do some traveling because in 1889 she applied for a U.S. passport. She continued leading the Women's Alliance at the Church of Disciples and organizing suffrage associations. For those of you who missed my earlier videos, we know that when Charles and Fanny lived in Boston, suffragettes Lucy Stone, Julia Ward Howe, Mary Livermore, and Susan B. Anthony became good friends. Charles and Fanny's daughter Alice will later write that they were like family. Lucy Stone was 10 years older than Charles and 22 years older than Fanny. Julia was 1 year younger than Lucy, and Mary Livermore and Susan B. were 1 year younger than Julia. By this time, Mary Livermore had moved back to Boston from Chicago. Her women's rights journal, The Agitator, had combined with Lucy Stone's Women's Journal, which had become the most important newspaper advocating women's rights. Mary Livermore and Frances Willard won't write their Encyclopedia of Great American Women of the 19th Century until 1897. 1890 was a significant year for women's suffrage. On February 18th, the National Women's Suffrage Association, which had been founded by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, united with the American Women's Suffrage Association, founded by Lucy Stone. The new organization became the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Their principal aim was to obtain an amendment to the Constitution giving women the right to vote. Mary Livermore played a conciliatory role in helping the two organizations consolidate. They set up headquarters in Washington, D.C., and elected Elizabeth Cady Stanton to be their president. But she tended to let Susan B. Anthony, the vice president, run things. They elected Lucy Stone to be the chairman of the executive committee. However, Lucy's health was declining. As we shall see, she dies 3 years later. That same year, 1890, Fanny, Julia Ward Howe, Mary Livermore, and others from the New Century Club founded another organization for women called the General Federation of Women's Clubs. It meant to elevate women through education to become active members and leaders of their community. At weekly club meetings, women discussed current literature, culture, and civic events. Members worked on ways to improve the local public schools, libraries, parks, and sanitation. The Federation supported legislation to protect children, such as child labor laws, and they developed programs to help impoverished women so they needn't resort to prostitution. One of the organizations that the General Federation of Women's Clubs oversaw was the Junior League, which I belonged to when I was in my 30s. Most people don't know that the Junior League is a volunteer training organization. Women under the age of 40 are taught business and leadership skills as well as community government structure, so that as they become older and their children move away, they know how to run nonprofit organizations. Charles and Fanny's daughter Alice, who was 25 in 1890, may have joined the Federation at that time. 30 years later, she will become the Federation's national president. Now let me tell you why in 2019, Fanny was honored by the Massachusetts State Police Museum. On May 9, 1891, Governor Russell of Massachusetts appointed 51-year-old Fanny and 41-year-old Mary Ellen Haley of Natick, Massachusetts, as state police inspectors for the Massachusetts State Police. The curator of today's museum, Officer Ron Guillemette, explained to me that in the early years of the Industrial Revolution, especially in New England, the state legislature passed more and more laws to regulate factories but had no one to enforce them. The legislature passed many of those duties to the state police, including the inspection of factories, the enforcement of child labor laws, and the 10-hour workday law. The state police assigned Fanny to the inspection department to help enforce the new child labor laws. In the last video, we described Fanny's work with the Children's Aid Society and Bureau of Information in Philadelphia. Her experience included working with state institutions that serviced the urban poor. Mary Ellen's background was a little different. She had actually worked as a weaver in the textile mills in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Not only were Fanny and Mary Ellen the first women hired on the Massachusetts State Police, but they were the first women ever hired as police officers in the whole nation. The women were bona fide police officers with all the same powers of arrest as those officers assigned to the detective department. But even though they were treated as full-fledged officers, they didn't receive the pay the men did. Fanny will hold her position as a factory inspector for the next 6.5 years. A lot went on during that time. For one, there was another recession. The main cause was once again greed. Over 15,000 companies failed and some 500 banks. Unemployment jumped to 21%. This, of course, affected Fanny's job considerably. Meanwhile, Charles and Fanny's daughter Alice got married to an Englishman named Thomas Gerald Winter. They'd met on a train crossing Canada. The couple settled in Minneapolis across the Mississippi from Alice's half-brother, Charles Wilberforce Ames, and his family. A year later, Alice and Tom had a son they named Gilbert, after one of Tom Winter's brothers. In the fall of 1893, Charles's longtime friend, Lucy Stone, passed away. She will miss the passing of the 19th Amendment. Charles conducted the funeral services for her at the Church of Disciples. 1,100 people crowded the church. Hundreds more stood silently outside. Mourners lined the streets for a sight of the funeral procession. Front-page banner headlines ran in news accounts. Lucy's death was the most widely reported of any American woman's up to that time. A year after that, in the fall of 1894, Charles and Fanny's youngest daughter, Edith, matriculated at Smith College in Northampton, 104 miles west of Boston. Her classmates elected her vice president her freshman year. Smith College sent me these snapshots that one of Edith's roommates took of her while she was there. At the end of December 1895, Alice and Tom in Minneapolis gave Fanny and Charles another grandchild, my grandmother, Edith Ames Winter. The next year, the Massachusetts State Police sent Fanny on a mission. This is the ship manifest. I haven't figured out yet who A.L. Ames was. Fanny spent 4 months traveling around Europe, touring factories and studying legislation regarding factory work. Hopefully, she made it back to the States in time to attend a ceremony at Bates College in Lewiston, Maine, when they honored Charles with a Doctor of Divinity. Bates was the first coeducational college in New England to admit students without regard to race, religion, national origin, or sex. From then on, Charles will be referred to as Dr. Ames. Also in 1896, Smith College Monthly published a poem that Edith wrote. I will read the first verse. It may sound familiar. O Father, give me wisdom, give me strength, wisdom to see thy truth, the strength to do, and grant through these thy fair serenity, that stands when others deem my truth untrue. Edith's father, probably through the Unitarian community, spread the poem around. Today, though it's been changed a little, the poem is known as the Serenity Prayer. In December of the next year, 1897, 57-year-old Fanny retired from the Massachusetts State Police. Their records state that she needed to take care of a sick daughter. Smith College records show that Edith left the college that year without graduating. I have yet to uncover any more details. Edith couldn't have been too ill because she accompanied her mother on another European trip soon after. Fanny's co-worker, Mary Ellen, will continue with the force until 1928. She will retire after working 37 years to protect the rights of women and children working in Massachusetts' textile mills. She will never marry. After Fanny retired, she focused her attention on women's education and the suffrage movement. A women's college named after its founder, John Simmons of Boston, was opening its doors. The first Board of Trustees asked Fanny to join them. John Simmons wanted a college where women could learn how to earn independent livelihoods and lead meaningful lives. As we know, Simmons wasn't the first women's college in the United States. Early women's schools, called seminaries, trained women to be teachers. The first women's college was in Fanny's beloved Germantown. Both Wellesley, which Alice attended, and Smith, which Edith attended, didn't open their doors until 133 years later in 1875. Also in 1899, Charles officiated the marriage of his grandson, Vernon Ames Wright, to Grace Tilson Clark at his Church of the Disciples. He and Fanny held the reception at 12 Chestnut Street. As to the women's rights movement, by 1900, the National American Women's Suffrage Association needed new blood. 80-year-old Susan B. Anthony retired that year. 84-year-old Elizabeth Cady Stanton lived mainly in England, and Lucy Stone had passed away. Fortunately, some feisty women were at the ready. Susan B. Anthony had groomed 41-year-old Carrie Chapman Catt of Wisconsin to take her place. Carrie was a school superintendent. She'd received her B.S. from today's Iowa State. As the new president, she invited young Radcliffe graduate Maud Wood Park to attend the NAWSA's yearly convention. This newspaper photo shows Carrie in the middle and Maud on the right of the balcony of the Suffrage House in Washington, D.C. Maud Park was from Boston. She'd taught school there for 8 years and then attended Radcliffe College to obtain her B.A. She was 29 years old when she attended the NAWSA convention, but surprised to learn that she was the youngest delegate there. Maud determined to do what she could to bring younger women into the movement. She and another Radcliffe grad, Inez Haynes Gilmore Irwin, who was a couple years younger, founded the College Equal Suffrage League. The organization spurred college suffrage groups throughout the nation. Apparently, Edith Ames did not join the League. She did not return to Smith after leaving in October of her senior year. Instead, in 1900, she got married. Charles officiated her wedding at his Church of Disciples to 27-year-old Raymond Moreau Crosby. Crosby had graduated from Yale and was already a famous illustrator. There are many examples of his work for Life magazine online. Charles and Fanny held the wedding reception at their home at 12 Chestnut Street, just as they had for their daughter Alice and grandson Vernon. Edith was the only child who did not settle in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. Vernon, the only surviving child of Serena Ames, had purchased a home around the corner from Alice in Minneapolis. And as mentioned, Charles Wilberforce and his family lived in St. Paul. But Edith and Raymond settled in Yarmouthport on Cape Cod. Meanwhile, Fanny's involvement with the suffrage movement continued on the local level. Even though the movement began 60 years earlier, activity in Washington, D.C. wouldn't start hopping for another decade. By 1900, only 4 states officially supported women's suffrage: Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado. In 1901, Fanny helped Maud Wood Park found the Boston Equal Suffrage Association for Good Government, known as BSAG. It was devoted to women's suffrage in Massachusetts, and, like the College Equal Suffrage League, attracted younger women. This ad from the Boston Globe shows B-side women dressed up for a performance to raise funds for the Women's Journal. From 1901 to 1905, Fanny helped Charles and the congregation of the Church of Disciples oversee the building of a new church on the corner of Jersey and Peterborough Streets. Then in 1907, a family tragedy occurred, which would distract Fanny from community work temporarily. 14-year-old Gilbert, Alice and Tom Winter's son, and a neighbor friend were hanging out in Tom's study when Tom and Alice were away from the house. While the friend, who hadn't been taught to handle a gun properly, as Gilbert had, was inspecting a Smith & Wesson handgun that Tom kept in his desk, he accidentally shot Gilbert in the stomach. Gilbert died shortly after. His young sister Edith was 12 at the time. Meanwhile, Charles was putting together a book of his prayers, which the Unitarian Church published in 1908. Charles had reached his 80s, but he still traveled regularly between Philadelphia and Boston. In 1910, Julia Ward Howe died in her home in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. She was 91. 4,000 people, probably including Charles and Fanny, sang the Battle Hymn of the Republic at her memorial. Finally, we are on the home stretch of the movement to obtain American women the right to vote. In 1910, a young suffragist entered the scene who, like a quarterback, will carry the ball past the finish line. 25-year-old Alice Paul from New Jersey was 20 years younger than Alice Ames Winter and 12 years younger than Edith Ames Crosby. She had just spent 2 years in England studying. Like Julia Ward Howe and Lucretia Mott, she had a Quaker background. Alice Paul obtained her bachelor's from Swarthmore College, which her grandfather co-founded, a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, and will later obtain a couple of law degrees. While in London, Alice joined the Women's Social and Political Union established by Christabel Harriet Pankhurst, who was about 5 years older, and Christabel's mum, Emmeline Pankhurst. English suffrage protests were a lot livelier than American protests. While in England, Alice Paul was arrested numerous times and served 3 jail terms. She also got to know another American studying in London named Lucy Burns. Lucy was 6 years older than Alice and will join her in America 2 years later in 1912. By 1910, Washington State had joined the movement. California joined the ranks in 1911, and Arizona, Kansas, and Oregon were added to the list in 1912. But the Ames family wasn't thinking much about women's suffrage in 1912. On April 15th, Charles passed away at his home on 12 Chestnut Street. He was 82. He had witnessed the emancipation of slavery, but will miss out when women get the right to vote. Fanny moved to Yarmouth to live with Edith and Raymond Crosby on Cape Cod. The couple had no children. During the next 19 years, Fanny will still spend time in Boston, residing at the Women's Club. She will visit children and grandchildren in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and eventually Chicago. 6 months after Charles died, she took a trip to England. This manifest shows 72-year-old Fanny B. Ames returning home on the SS Canadian from Liverpool. The Titanic had taken the same route 6 months earlier, but didn't make it. Trivial fact, the Titanic sank on the same day Charles Gordon Ames died. In 1913, Fanny and Alice helped the Houghton Mifflin Publishing Company publish Charles's spiritual autobiography. As I've frequently mentioned, Alice wrote the epilogue, which I've quoted for this video, and the corresponding book. I do not know if either Alice or Fanny were involved in the flurry of activity going on in Washington, D.C. that year. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns had organized a parade. Some 5 to 10,000 women representing almost every state. It was the first large organized march on Washington, D.C. for a political purpose. They flooded down Pennsylvania the day before President Wilson's inauguration parade. A New York newspaper stated that the procession started out as one of the most impressively beautiful spectacles ever staged in the country. There were bands, banners, squadrons, chariots, and floats that showed women at home, in school, and at the workplace. There were some African American marchers too, though not many. Howard University, our current Vice President Kamala Harris's alma mater, participated, but they did cause a stir from the Southern participants. Nearing the end, however, things went bad as men began heckling the women from the sidewalks. The police had promised to provide extra protection, but they didn't. In fact, many police just stood there and watched. Citizen groups and the cavalry had to step in to let the parade finish. Alice Paul was intent on obtaining the attention of the press. She had some more tricks up her sleeve which she had learned from the Pankhursts in London. These included disrupting speakers, picketing, serving jail time, and ultimately going on a hunger strike. The suffragists were making a little progress, at least in the western states. Nevada and Montana joined the movement in 1914. But on July 28th of that year, Austria and Hungary shelled the Serbian capital of Belgrade and ignited the Great World War. A few days later, Germany declared war on Russia. 2 days after that, German forces invaded Belgium. 9 days later, Britain and France allied with Russia. And only 2 days after that, 74-year-old Fanny arrived home to Boston from Genoa, Italy, on the White Star Line's SS Canopic. That means she was in Italy learning about all the events I just listed and managed to get out of Dodge just in time. In spite of war, Alice Paul, Carrie Catt, and their friends made sure the suffrage cause kept moving. Since many women in the NAWSA didn't like the militant tactics instigated by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, Alice and Lucy broke off their own group. At first they called it the Congressional Union for Women Suffrage. By 1916, the name changed to the National Women's Party. That was the year they started a picketing campaign in front of the White House that lasted nearly 2 years. The NWP wanted to change President Wilson's attitude on suffrage. 6 days a week, women who became known as the Silent Sentinels peacefully stood outside the White House holding banners. Each day a speaker made a presentation. They held themed state days such as New Jersey Day and Connecticut Day. They held professional days such as Doctor's Day and Teacher's Day. But with war raging in Europe, many accused the Silent Sentinels of being unpatriotic. Picketing had been made legal in 1914, so the women weren't doing anything criminal. But local authorities arrested Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, and some others for the crime of obstructing traffic. Over the next 6 months, the women were convicted and incarcerated in one of 2 jails, some with 7-month sentences. Officials placed Lucy in the Occoquan workhouse in Virginia. They placed Alice Paul in the district jail in Washington, D.C. Alice Paul argued that she and the other women should be treated as political prisoners, not as criminals, but lost her case. In protest to the horrible food they served, Alice went on a hunger strike, but the guards force-fed her. The force feeding caused permanent damage to Alice Paul's body, but since it caught the interest of the press, the political repercussions helped the movement immensely. The worst of the government offense occurred at Occoquan Workhouse on November 14th, which would be called the Night of Terror. Police delivered 33 women to the prison. When the women demanded to be treated as political prisoners, Superintendent William H. Whitaker called on his guards to teach the women a lesson. The guards burst into the room where the women were waiting to be booked, dragged them down the hall, and threw them into dark, filthy cells. Lucy Burns had her hands shackled to the top of a cell, forcing her to stand all night. The guards also threatened her with a straitjacket and a buckle gag. Dorothy Day was slammed down on the arm of an iron bench twice. Dora Lewis lost consciousness after her head was smashed into an iron bed. Alice Kosu, seeing Lewis's assault, suffered a heart attack and didn't get medical attention until the following morning. The press had a field day. On November 27th and 28th, the prisons released all the women. 5 weeks later, President Wilson announced that he supported the suffrage amendment. Meanwhile, some members of the Ames family were on a different mission. On February 15th, 1918, 2 of Fanny's 5 granddaughters sailed on the SS Touraine to France. 23-year-old Edith Winter, the daughter of Alice and Tom in Minneapolis, along with Betty Ames, the daughter of Charles Wilberforce and Mary in St. Paul, headed to Paris to work as nurses' aides. Charles Wilberforce, Mary, and their 6 young adult children had founded an organization called the American Fund for French Wounded. Working alongside the Red Cross, the fund helped French people who had been devastated by the German armies, and refugees from elsewhere in Europe who flooded into Paris after the Germans departed. As American troops joined the British and French forces, including Edith's future husband, Knowlton Lyman Ames, Jr. of Chicago, the American Fund for French Wounded helped with other medical needs. Only a month after Edith and Betty arrived, what would be called the Spanish flu began ravaging the northern hemisphere. Some scientists think American forces carried the virus to Europe. It hit France before it hit Spain. However, French and American forces kept quiet about the epidemic because they didn't want the Germans to know their forces were weakened. Back home, an unusual and scary event occurred off the coast of Cape Cod. 19 miles away from where Fanny lived with Edith and Raymond, a German U-boat attacked and destroyed 5 vessels, including a tugboat and several barges. But for some reason, after the U-boat sank the tugboat, it slipped away, and that was that. Finally, 4 months later, Germany signed an armistice, and the Americans came home. As soon as the war was over, the suffragists focused again on Congress and the Senate to pass the Susan B. Anthony bill. In Part 3, we described how Senator Aaron Sargent from California introduced the bill 40 years earlier in 1878. Sargent had passed away in San Francisco in 1887, but his bill had been reintroduced to the House every year for those 40 years. In 1918, the bill passed in the House of Representatives but was defeated in the Senate. On May 12, 1919, it passed in the House of Representatives 309 votes to 89, 42 votes more than the required amount needed for a 2/3 majority. 3 weeks later, it finally passed in the Senate, 56 votes to 25. The next step was that 36 of the 48 states needed to ratify it. That task turned out to be not so easy and would take another year. On June 10, 1919, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin became the first states to say yes. 15 days later, on June 25th, which would have been Fanny and Charles's 55th wedding anniversary, their home state of Massachusetts became the 8th state to ratify the amendment, even though the state had a strong anti-suffrage presence. However, Fanny was not in Boston to celebrate with the few friends who were still living. In spite of the fact that the pandemic still raged, Fanny had taken a train to Minneapolis, Minnesota, where 2 days later her granddaughter Edith married Knowlton Lyman Ames, Jr. Knowlton, who was known by his friends and family as Junie, had served with the army in Paris, where Edith was a nurse's aide. I wonder, how did Fanny feel that day? She had been working for women's rights for 55 years, just so that her female descendants could have the right to vote. Yet her granddaughter probably didn't give a hoot when the cause was nearly won. After Edith and Junie enjoyed their honeymoon and settled in Chicago, the amendment passed in Minnesota, where Edith's parents, Alice and Tom Winter, did celebrate. Alice will continue with the women's rights movement, as we will show you in a separate video. After 35 states passed the legislation, the final vote came down to Tennessee, the same state that decided the 2020 election exactly 100 years later. But their legislature was split. On a very dramatic day, a young man named Harry T. Byrne, under pressure from his mother, changed his mind at the last minute and voted in favor of the amendment. Ratification was complete. Did 80-year-old Fanny get to celebrate? Her husband Charles was gone. So were her suffragette friends in California. Peter and Susan Leslie had died 17 years earlier. The old guard, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Henry Blackwell were also gone. Of Fanny's Boston friends, only Maud Park was still around. The new group of suffragettes, led by Alice Paul, will redirect their efforts toward an equal rights amendment. Yet to this day, 100 years later, that amendment has still not passed. The same year the 19th Amendment passed, Alice in Minneapolis became the president of the General Federation of Women's Clubs that Fanny and her old friend Julia Ward Howe founded 30 years earlier. The membership will peak in 1955 at 850,000 members in 16,000 clubs. The following year, in April 1921, Fanny's stepson, Charles Wilberforce Ames, passed away in St. Paul, Minnesota. He was only 66 years old. All of his 6 children had married. Most of them were living with their many children in the Twin Cities area. But Fanny had not gone idle. The year the amendment passed, which was also the 300th anniversary of the Mayflower sailing in 1620, Fanny helped Alice apply for membership to the Society of Mayflower Descendants. Fanny's father, Increase Beaker, had been a descendant of Mayflower passengers Richard Warren, Francis Cook, and John Cook. We have 3 letters in our records that Fanny wrote about her Baker genealogy. 2 are written from Boston on the Women's City Club letterhead. 1 was written from Kittery, Maine. Fanny and Alice were not able to complete that application, but thanks to their diligent research, I was able to finish it nearly 100 years later. 85-year-old Fanny probably helped Alice with her 3rd book, The Business of Being a Clubwoman, which was published in 1925. And maybe she helped Alice with her 4th book, The Heritage of Women, published 2 years later. Fanny was 89 when, in October 1929, the American stock market crashed. So it was that during the 3rd financial recession of her lifetime, she passed away at age 91 in Barnstable on Cape Cod, which was probably where the nearest hospital was to her home in Yarmouthport. Alice and Edith held a memorial for her in the Church of Disciples, where Fanny had for 40 years led the Women's Alliance. The service took place in the building on the corner of Jersey and Peterborough Streets that was erected during Charles's leadership and dedicated in 1905. Today, that building houses the Seventh-day Adventists. In 1942, the Congregation of the Church of Disciples will forget about their differences in Unitarian doctrine and combine with the Arlington Church congregation that still serves Boston's Back Bay community today. The family buried Fanny's ashes in Minneapolis next to those of her beloved Charles, her mother, Julia Ann Canfield Baker, and her grandson, Gilbert Winter, in the plot that Alice and Tom Winter had purchased when Gilbert died. It is dominated by a Presbyterian cross because Alice and Tom were Presbyterians, not Unitarians. Lakewood Cemetery is located at the south end of Hennepin Avenue, not far from where the Winters were living. Later, Alice and Tom will be buried there along with Alice's sister Edith, Alice's daughter Edith, and their husbands. You might wonder how we know all this information. I learned a lot from reading Charles's spiritual autobiography. I learned more from the collection of family papers now held in the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe in Cambridge. You remember Maud Wood Park, right? The one who with Fanny founded the Boston Equal Suffrage Association for Good Government. Well, in August of 1943, 12 years after Fanny's death, Maud donated a collection of information on women's rights to Radcliffe College Library. 2 of the folders in that collection came from Fanny. Maybe Alice and Edith gave the folders to Maud. I don't know. At any rate, that is how Radcliffe's women's collection first came about. During the 1940s and 1950s, Maud and Fanny's documents were added to and named the Women's Archives at Radcliffe College. 15 years after that, in 1965, the ever-expanding collection was renamed after Harvard University's historian Arthur Schlesinger and his wife Elizabeth. A few years ago, my second cousin, once removed, Mary Wolfe, and her daughter, Linda Cowan, added even more documents and letters to the collection at Schlesinger Library. Those documents had been gathering dust in Charles Wilberforce Ames's expansive attics in his home in St. Paul for nearly a century. When the last of Charles W.'s grandchildren died and the family sold the house, Mary Wolfe rescued the papers, paid someone to catalog them, and donated the Ames Family Historical Collection to the Schlesinger Library. I've only sifted through a few boxes of the Ames collection. There is much more research to do if you want to dig deeper into these stories. Today's Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe houses what is probably the largest collection of information on women's suffrage in the United States. I'll place a link to their catalog page in the description below. We did it! We finished this series! I have been working on this project all through COVID, and I'll tell you, it's been really fun to research it, but I am so glad to be done and I can move on to other things. For those of you who don't know anything about my channels, I have 2 YouTube channels. I have this channel, which is mostly about my writing stuff, about my family, and then I have another channel called Rambling and Ramsey about rambling around the United States in my camper van called Ramsey. So check that out too if you want to see what other activities we're up to in this family besides family history. And thanks so much for watching and making it through. I'm assuming that if you're watching this video, you've seen the other 4. And I hope you learned something, and especially if you're part of my family, I hope it helps you understand what your background is. All right, love you all, and till next time, bye. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up if you like this video. Subscribing costs you nothing and gives me clout on YouTube. If you click the bell icon, you will receive an email when I post the next video. This information will be available on Amazon in paperback format by September 2021, I hope.